coming up on the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast.
Well, okay, so I love seafood, fish and seafood.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to know like what is the very, very best food you can get on this whole PE diet concept, it's basically fish and seafood. This is like a superfood. Fish has insanely high satiety per calorie, insanely high nutrient density, insanely high protein and minerals for the amount of calories you're getting. So that's off the charts. So for me, it's like wild caught salmon and wild caught seafood is just absolutely top of the ultimate
Sardines.
foods pyramid.
Sardines.
Yes, you got it. Anything
Yeah.
like that. Sardines, it's awesome. Um, Clams, mussels, oysters, sardines, any kind of wild caught fish and seafood, amazing. Definitely top of the list for me.
Hello, and welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I'm Brian Grin, and I'm here to give you actionable tips to get your body back to what it once was 5, 10, even 15 years ago. Each week, I'll give you an in-depth interview with a health expert from around the world to cut through the fluff and get you long-term sustainable results. In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Ted Naiman. He's a board-certified family medicine physician and co-authored the PE Diet book. His personal research and medical practice are focused on practical implementation of diet and exercise for health optimization. In this interview, we discussed a bunch of different topics. What is energy overload? The importance of protein, fiber, and minerals. Also, foods to eat to become satiated. We also dive into his PE diet book, the importance of minerals, his favorite sources of potassium, what's called carb periodization, and his daily diet and fasting routine. We also touch on Exercise 2.0, which is a high-intensity, high-frequency bodyweight workout, and his thoughts regarding seafood, dairy, foods to avoid, and much, much more. So I really enjoyed my interview with Dr. Ted, and I know you will too. Thanks so much, and enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. And my guest today, Dr. Ted Naiman, is a board-certified family medicine physician out of Seattle and also author of the PE Diet. And we're going to talk about a bunch of that stuff today. So welcome in, Dr. Ted.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you coming on the show. And got a lot of topics we're going to talk about because really this podcast is all about helping individuals get their bodies back to what it once was. And I noticed on your website, you've made quite a transformation in your body. Maybe tell us the background behind that and how you got into like health and wellness.
Oh yeah, okay, sure. So basically, my background was mechanical engineering. I got an engineering degree, and I'm up here in Seattle, and I couldn't really get a job because of some Boeing layoffs at the time I graduated. So I just kind of on a whim decided to go to medical school. And I was raised Adventist, so I ended up going to Loma Linda University, which is this sort of famous vegetarian mecca down in Southern California. And I got a medical degree from Loma Linda, and they have a big health focus there. Diet, of course, it's all plant-based and a little bit weird.
Mm-hmm.
But I did come from this sort of health-centric background, but I noticed that like personally I never enjoyed really great health. Like I never had really good body composition, and I never looked or felt any better than anyone else, even though on paper I was following this vegetarian plant-based diet that's supposed to be the very healthiest. And I came from this Loma Linda blue zone where everybody supposedly lives the longest.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I learned from that is like, oh, well, diet doesn't really matter. Like, who cares? Diet's not that important. I'm looking around at all my fellow doctors from Loma Linda who are plant-based. And I'm like, okay, I've got all these people here who go way out of their way to eat the healthiest diet, the plant-based diet. They're doctors. Nobody on earth has more knowledge about diet than these healthy plant-based doctors from Loma Linda. And none of them look particularly good. None of them, their health isn't really any better than probably a lot of people. So I took away from that, well, diet doesn't really matter. And then I started my residency in family medicine in South Carolina, and I was just it was just a deluge of obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and just tons of really bad pathology.
Hmm.
And I was still thinking, well, this is mostly genetic. These people just have, all their parents are diabetic. If both your parents are obese, there's an 80% chance you're going to be obese. If both your parents have type 2 diabetes, there's an 80% chance you're going to have type 2 diabetes.
Mm.
And so I'm like, okay, diet doesn't matter. It's mostly genetics. We're supposed to feel sorry for these people and just give them more insulin. And then I had a patient who, and this was about in the late 90s. This is like
Mm.
20, a little over 20 years ago. This patient came in and he had gone on like an Atkins diet, and he told me, wow, I lost 30 pounds and it felt really easy. I wasn't that hungry and it was effortless. And I stopped taking all my meds. My blood pressure's fine and my blood sugar's fine. And this just blew me away. And I was like, wow, here's this guy who, he wasn't raised plant-based. He didn't go to this ivory tower medical school with this, academic plant-based diet message. He just like read a $5 paperback from Dr. Atkins and
Yeah.
managed to cure his type 2 diabetes. And this blew me away. I'm like, wow, maybe I've got it all wrong. Maybe diet really is important, and maybe I just haven't cracked the code yet.
Right.
And then I started really paying a lot of attention to all the patients I was seeing. And I'm like, wow, what really is the difference between the super healthy people I see and the super unhealthy people I see? And I started asking a lot of questions. I'm like, what's your diet like? What are you eating? What's your exercise like? And I realized that a lot of these big differences that I was seeing in my patients, in my clients, were just diet and exercise, and it was really really mind blowing to me. And so I started researching, and I'm old as hell, so this is back in the day where we didn't even have like, you can just do a PubMed search. Like, I actually had to look up articles, and so
Mm.
I just started researching everything I could find. And
Yeah.
pretty much for the past 20 years, I've been researching anything I can find on diet and exercise and health outcomes. And I think that this has culminated into the book I wrote last year, The PE Diet, which is basically just everything I've gleaned from diet and exercise over the years, working with patients, trying things myself, researching the primary medical literature. And this is kind of where I've ended up, and it's just been a really interesting journey. And I certainly don't feel like I've arrived yet. It's just a constant process of like learning. And I've changed over the years and iterated, but I'm constantly trying to basically do the best I can with the knowledge I have so far. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. First and foremost, I mean, we can learn a lot from our clients. I sort of had the same same thing happen to me. A client of mine was like pre-diabetic, and she started getting into fasting, and that was something that I didn't know that much about. I mean, I know the major religions were using fasting for many years, for a long time, but I was like, wow, you can actually do this to help help yourself. And she was pre-diabetic. All her numbers came back to normal, and I was like, wow, I got to learn about this. And I noticed some of your writings. I've actually read a lot. You did a nice PDF of intermittent fasting, I noticed. I don't know how long ago you wrote that, but I noticed that on your website. Is that something that you focus on with your clients as well, along with like obviously how to eat correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I love intermittent fasting, but for me, fasting is definitely on a U-shaped curve where I feel if people push it too far, then they're just super, super hungry and they eat all of this energy dense food afterwards
Mm.
and gain. So I see people who rely on fasting too much, just gaining and losing and gaining and losing the same 5 pounds over and over again. And so I don't like extended fasting. I don't like over leveraging fasting, but like a certain amount of fasting, I think is awesome. It's
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, gets people in touch with hunger and fullness, and it gets people less glucose dependent on exogenous carbohydrates, and you get really good at living off your own stored body fat, kind of the way you're supposed to. But there's definitely this sweet spot to it, I think, where you have to, it's a little different for everyone, and you have to find out where that is. And it's, somewhere between 1 and 24 hours a day is probably averagey for most people, with highly variable, results. And it kind of depends on the person and the way the rest of their diet is. But it's definitely a really good tool in the toolbox that everybody should be trying out at least a little bit. I think you're just leaving money on the table if you're not exploring that.
I completely agree. I think, like you said, everyone's different. I mean, when I first started, I just simply moved back breakfast an hour, and just like my goal was just to gradually push it back till about noon. And then, once you get comfortable with that, you sort of see where you're at. Am I happy? Have I reached my health goals? And then you can sort of adjust it from there. But I agree, it is a tool that everyone should utilize. And yeah, no, I completely agree. I noticed that you talk a lot about like energy overload, and I was curious. I wanted to sort of touch on that. What would you say your definition of that is?
Okay, so all of these chronic degenerative diseases that we have that are related to hyperinsulinemia, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, high insulin levels, these are all really caused by having too much energy in your body. You've literally tried to store too much energy. Now, humans store, the vast majority of their energy, over 99%, is fat. So you really have too much fat in your
Right. I
body.
was going to say, is that a nice way of saying if too much fat, energy overload, right?
Yeah, you're just basically too fat. I'll just come out and say it.
Yeah.
But even someone who looks thin and someone who's skinny fat,
Yeah.
if they have elevated fasting insulin levels and if they have the other hallmarks of metabolic syndrome, they're just completely over fat, and they've literally tried to store too much energy in the form of fat. And so you fill up your subcutaneous fat cells, and then that spills over into visceral fat and ectopic fat. And then the reason your insulin's high all the time is because you have no place to put incoming energy. So all your cells are refusing fat energy. You've maybe expanded your fat cells maximally, and you have all this energy circulating in your bloodstream all the time. That could be triglycerides and glucose, and you just don't have any place to put it. And this is just plain and simple energy toxicity.
Right.
And you simply develop energy toxicity if the amount of energy in your food is out of proportion to the satiety in that food, which is mostly protein and fiber and minerals. So you strip the energy out of foods, carbs and fats, eat too many of those without enough satiety, which is protein, fiber, and minerals, and then do that for a couple days, weeks, months, years, and next thing you know, you've tried to store too much energy in your body, and you're still hungry, and then you have hyperinsulinemia, metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, diabetes, the whole spectrum of chronic degenerative diseases that I've labeled energy toxicity in the book.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we talk about satiety, and it's such like an important thing, especially if you're eating the right foods and you're fasting, if you're not going to eat your next meal for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, it's so important to have satiety. What would you say is the main hallmark behind having satiety, and what kind of foods would you recommend?
Well, so in the book we kind of talk about the different forms of hungers, right? There's a nutrient hunger. Humans have a specific appetite for basically four things: protein, carbs, fat, and minerals, specifically sodium and calcium. So you really have specific targeted appetites for, the three macronutrients as well as minerals like sodium and calcium.
Mhm.
And if you're not getting enough of any of these things, you're going to have this weird nutrient hunger where you're just going to eat more until you get these things. Protein's probably one of the strongest hungers of all. And so if you didn't get enough protein, you're basically just going to eat and eat and eat until you do get enough protein. And that's why going out of your way to target things like protein and minerals right off the bat, I think it leads to a lot less downstream hunger. And then once you've kind of gotten that nutrient hunger out of the way, then you can be in a much better place to evaluate whether you have energy hunger or not. Like if you're actually hungry for energy calories. And then that can be further subdivided into, are you hungry for glucose because you're used to just eating carbs 8 times a day, 300 grams every 2 hours, and your blood sugar is rising and falling over and over, and you can kind of feel this. And so you're just hungry for some cornflakes versus actually needing more energy globally in your body, whether it's glucose or not. You know what I mean? So there are these different levels of hunger, and the goal is to try to satisfy those in an order that sets you up for success. So like you target protein first, and protein and minerals, and fiber, because humans just eat a certain weight of food every day, no matter how many calories are in it. So you're eating foods with a lot of protein, fiber, water, minerals. You're making sure that you're not glucose dependent with some sort of either cyclical keto diet or intermittent fasting or something, so you're not as glucose dependent as most people. And then you're in a lot better place to tell if you're really hungry for just calories, for just energy, right? You know, like, do I really need that MCT oil and that pre-workout dextrose, you know, or just some sort of pure energy thing? You're in a lot better place to know if you're hungry for that after you've satisfied all these other satieties. And we kind of lay that out in the book as well.
Yeah, and I'm curious, as far as minerals, is that simply adding just like a quality salt to your meals, or how would you obtain getting those minerals?
So mostly you want to obtain them from real food. I'm not a huge supplement fan. I don't recommend any supplementation. I do put salt on my food, which is probably a sodium supplement, but I don't use a ton of salt, and I'm actually more worried about potassium and magnesium intakes in most people, and you really do want to get that from real food, because we know from studies that it's superior to get these from real food than taking them in a supplement form.
And so, go ahead. Well, I was going to say potassium. Where would you say a good place to get potassium from?
Right. So potassium is in meat. Animal products have potassium in them. And you also get a lot of potassium in certain plant foods, like your avocado has a lot of potassium in it. And, I personally like low sugar fruit. I like green vegetables. I like fish and seafood, which is amazing. And those are my favorite sources.
Okay. So also, I noticed you talk a little bit about seasonal eating. Is that something that you do yourself and that you teach your clients?
Well, so what I like is some sort of carbohydrate periodization, right? So my theory is that, humans maybe didn't have access to carbohydrate, 24/7, 365. And we see animals living in the wild. They'll have a colder season or a rainier season or a darker season or a season with the sun. And then the foods they're eating are lower in carbohydrate. So like, if you look at your average gorilla or something, there's a rainy season where they're eating way more leaves, and the protein percentage of their diet is a lot higher, and the carbohydrate content of their diet is a lot lower, and they're literally getting thinner. They have higher lean mass to fat mass in their body composition. And then they'll have a season, like a fruiting season, where there's tons of fruit and they get tons of carbs and tons of sugar, and the protein to energy ratio of their diet falls, and they gain a lot more body. Well, maybe not a lot, but they gain more body fat. And so there's this sort of seasonality based on the amount of energy your environment, which is direct reflection of the amount of solar energy hitting the earth in your environment in recent months. So there's clearly some sort of period of time where humans have higher dietary energy and lower dietary energy from an evolutionary perspective. Like in the wintertime, you're just not getting a lot of plant carbohydrates. The animals that you're killing and eating are a lot thinner because they themselves are looking for more dietary energy from the environment. So you're getting a lot higher protein to energy ratio. It's basically lower carb and lower fat. And Then there are times, autumn where you just have tons and tons of, you got animals are all really fat because they had a lot of plant foods, maybe or herbivores, and so you're getting more dietary fat. You're also getting a lot more dietary carbs from plants. And so I like some sort of periodization. And for myself, what I do is I periodize carbs, and I'm actually doing a cyclical ketogenic diet where I'm eating carbohydrate just kind of maybe once a day in the evening.
Hmm.
And so,
What type of carb do you prefer in the evening?
fruit is definitely my favorite. So
Okay.
I'm just eating completely unlimited amounts of green vegetables, any sort of non-starchy vegetable, unlimited amounts of low sugar fruit, even maybe some higher sugar fruit, and some tubers possibly. Um,
So when you say low sugar fruit, you're meaning like mainly the berries.
Right, right. Low sugar fruit would be cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, olives, avocados, berries. Higher sugar fruit would be like just like a banana or a citrus or an apple or something like that.
Okay.
And I'm basically eating, unlimited amounts of low sugar fruit, and then maybe uh, not unlimited, but some, higher sugar fruit.
Gotcha. And do you normally eat 2 meals a day or three, or how do you sort of space your day out?
Well, my favorite is a 16/8 intermittent fast, skipping breakfast. So I
Okay.
basically eat lunch and dinner every day in roughly an 8-hour window. And I might throw a snack in there somewhere, depending on how hungry I am or how active I am or how many calories I burn doing cardio or whatever. So it's like 2 meals and a snack, maybe kind of thing in an 8-hour window. It's just extremely typical for me. Usually the carbs are backloaded. So first
Mm.
meal, I might have hardly any net carbs. It might be
Right.
just egg scramble with some flavor veggies in there, like peppers and mushrooms and onions or something like that. And then in the evening, almost like dessert, I'll have more carbohydrate. I'll have berries or something like that.
Yeah. I used to have like this big salad in the middle of the day, and put like I was more of like a pescatarian for a while, and now I've sort of actually ever since the quarantine started, I started going to meat, and it's amazing, good grass finished meat, and gotten away from the plants, and it is amazing adding in all that. I needed that protein. I mean, I'm active. I've been lifting for over 20 years, and I just felt like my body was sort of falling behind a little bit. And but the increase in protein is a game changer, and definitely I agree as far as, yeah, if I'm going to have some carbs, I'll backload them because I don't, you don't want to eat too close to when you go to sleep, but in the middle of the day, you want to sort of if you could stay in ketosis, right? And have, things that are higher in protein and maybe, moderate fats in the middle of the day. I found that's effective for me.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like we're doing kind of a similar thing there. That's cool.
Yeah. And I agree. I mainly do the same type of window. Sometimes I'll shrink it a little bit, and depending on my activity level as well. So you do cardio? Do you do any resistance training as well?
Yeah, so I love calisthenics. I'm like a calisthenics
Yeah.
fanatic, and
I know
I like to train
exercise
daily.
2.0.
What's that?
Exercise 2.0, right? I noticed on your website.
Oh, right, right, right. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if you, well, in the book, we basically break down how to do a full body resistance calisthenics workout, push, pull legs, just body weight, with almost no equipment, maybe something to pull on.
Right.
And I'm really into intensity, so I like maximizing intensity. I'm really into frequency, so I'm like doing a full body to failure daily or maybe every other day. Intensity maxed out, frequency pretty high, but the volume's tiny. So like I might only work out, 5 minutes a day, maybe 15 at the most.
Hmm.
And it's just the intensity is really high. I'm trading intensity for volume, basically.
That's interesting that you mentioned that because that's like a common theme I'm getting interviewing people like yourself and Brad Kearns and some other people. Like, um, it's not necessarily about like I was a little bit old school in the sense because I've lifted for a long time, and an hour and a half in the gym, and like now these like micro workouts. are becoming a big thing. And I also think, like you have sort of like an at-home, you could, body weight workouts and stuff. I think that's becoming obviously really popular because some gyms aren't even opening. But how did you get into sort of like these micro workouts? And I think it's great in the sense that, it's so easy to stay consistent that way, right?
Right. So the way I came up with this, so I realized that, building muscle, you're creating this functional tissue. It's an adaptation to a stress you put on your body.
Hmm.
And then I'm like, well, there's got to be an optimal frequency for this, right? And it's kind of like, it's sort of like calluses on your hands if you're digging ditches, or pigmenting your skin if you're getting a tan, right? And then, if you imagine that, once every 2 weeks, you just laid in the sun for like 6 hours and then just blistered yourself head to toe and then just didn't go out in the sun for the next 2 weeks, versus, like 15 minutes a day, which is going to give you the better
Right.
tan. Or if you just dug 100 ditches all day once a month till your hands were like bleeding, versus like, okay, one ditch every day.
Right.
It seems like these people who do stuff daily get some really solid muscle growth, like your gymnasts and your power lifters and people who have high frequency of training have excellent results. And I think that there's so many benefits to high frequency. First of all, there's the practicing the movement, right? So let's say I just work out once a week and I do my handstand push-ups. I mean, the first year of doing that once a week, I'm going to struggle just with my form and what it feels like and the mind muscle connection and just getting the movement pattern down. But if I'm doing that every day or
Hmm.
even twice a day, I'm really going to progress with my form and with my technique and with my mind muscle connection and with my ability to maximally engage the muscles. And so there are these neuromuscular benefits you get to a higher frequency, right? So I love this high frequency approach. I think intensity is the most important factor when it comes to resistance exercise. Like if you have some pink weights and you do 1,000 curls a day for the rest of your life, your bicep circumference is never ever going to increase, right? Ever at all. So intensity just has to be top, it has to be number one. I
Hmm.
like high frequency, and it makes sense to me if you're trying to get this functional adaptive tissue buildup, you know what I mean? That's going to be basically a positive adaptation to stress. You want like a little bit on a really regular basis. And that's how I kind of came up with this like whole body daily or every other day,
Yeah.
with a very high intensity. It feels natural to me. It makes a lot of sense to me. I see a lot more people going in this direction. It's a lot easier to do if you can do it at home with no equipment, because it's not realistic for most people to go to the gym, every day or every other day and do a full body workout with all these, you know, the squat rack and the machines and the barbells and all this stuff. So that I'm just trying to replicate that with body weight. Um,
It takes the excuses out, right?
yeah, it really
I
does.
mean,
And yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I mean, hey, 10 minutes and, full body workout, you really, because the number one excuse is they don't have time. Well, throw that out the door.
Right. And then in the book, we break it down into, there's just really these three basic movements you have to do with resistance, and that's push, pull, and legs.
Right.
And even that can be subdivided into little micro workouts that you can space out throughout the day. So like you could just drop to the floor right now and do a push routine that would take, 2 minutes and just completely fry your pushing muscles. And then later, when you're at the park or something, you can do your pulling when you have something to hang from or pull on. And so we're just trying to just break exercise down into the absolute minimum effective dose.
Hmm.
And it's all about sustainability and tiny time commitments and tiny um, investments in money. And basically, how can you get it done with the very least money, the very least time, the very least motivation, no barriers to entry? And
And you talk about intensity too. If you know you're doing something for only 10 minutes, then it's like, okay, I'm just going to go full bore, um, and be done. Like, if you have an hour and a half to spare to work out, then you're going to be like, well, maybe I don't need to be that intense with my workouts, but I think it's a mindset thing too.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I watch people, in the gym sometimes, and I'm sure they could compress their hour of just wandering around into
Right.
7 minutes, like what we're doing in the book, if they were just really maxing out the intensity dial to 11, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Have you messed around with any resistance bands? Because that was something I've gotten into during the quarantine, and I've gotten some good benefits from that.
I've tried resistance bands. I'm not a huge fan. For me, it doesn't really fit the strength curve of your muscles, and the resistance band. It doesn't really fit for me. Like if I'm doing push-ups with a resistance band, I want the highest resistance when my pecs are maximally stretched, like in the down position, and that's when I get the lowest resistance from the band. And so I really don't like that. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not a huge resistance band fan.
To each his own, right?
Right.
I've been using that X3, and
Hmm.
Dr. John, and yeah, I will say I've gotten great results from it, and I'm not sore, and it's a lot easier on my joints. But yeah, I mean, you can do effective things like you mentioned, just using body weight as well. I just think it depends. For me, I've been lifting weights for so long that like this was sort of like just a sort of a new thing for me, and it's nice to sort of mix it up and have something completely different, um, as well. So, well, we got exercise 2.0, so high intensity body weight exercises. We talked a little bit about diet 2.0, right, which is mainly, and I know this is in the book a lot, to increase protein and fiber. What do you say to, I know there's some advocates out there that don't really think that fiber is that necessary. What is your thought around your fiber?
So, really, really big picture,
Hmm.
you're going to get the best success when you have the very highest satiety per calorie, right? So, 91% of humans on Earth are over fat, and we have this just avalanche of obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome and chronic degenerative diseases. And let's say I can give you a food that's just this big, right? I'm holding my hands up and it's like a 1 inch cube. And let's say you eat that and you get a whole day's worth of satiety and it's like 50 calories, right? It's a super, super insanely high satiety per calorie.
Mm.
That is going to get you the very most success when it comes to fat loss and improving your body composition and reversing all of this stuff. So, the number one most important factor in everybody's diet in the modern diabetes epidemic is satiety per calorie. You want the highest long-term satiety you can possibly get for the very fewest calories. You always get that with foods that are higher in protein and fiber and lower in carbs and fats. And so I know it's super popular to just like be pure carnivore and be super extreme. Everyone's like, "Oh, I'm going to shave my carbs to zero. I'm going to shave my plant foods to zero. I'm going to
Mm.
just eat cubes of raw pork fat. That's going to be my whole diet forever, right?" But the problem is you're leaving a lot of um, really low satiety per calorie foods on the table. Your green vegetables have just insanely high satiety per calorie. And look at the Kevin Hall study that he recently did, looking at, a low fat plant based diet versus a low carb animal based diet, right? And the plant based people just automatically ate 500 less calories a day. Now, why did they do that? Is it because plants are magic? Is it because animals are bad? Is it because low fat is better than low carb? No, it's none of that stuff. It really just came down to energy density of the foods and satiety per calorie. The salad they were feeding those people had less than half the energy density of the like heavy cream and oil they were giving the keto side. So it turns out that green vegetables are just a really cheap and easy way to get extremely high satiety per calorie. And so I like that. And I think it's probably a mistake to completely eliminate it for, unless you have a really, really good reason.
Right. Like some type of like underlying issue,
Right.
perhaps, Um, so is there a food that you recommend, that like your favorite food that you like to have that's like a staple in your diet?
Well, okay. So I love seafood, fish and seafood.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to know like what is the very, very best food you can get on this whole PE diet concept, it's basically fish and seafood. This is like a superfood. Fish has insanely high satiety per calorie, insanely high nutrient density, insanely high protein and minerals for the amount of calories you're getting. So that's off the charts. So for me, it's like wild caught salmon and wild caught seafood is just absolutely top of the ultimate
Sardines.
foods pyramid.
Sardines.
Yes, you got it. Anything
Yeah.
like that. Sardines, it's awesome. Um, Clams, mussels, oysters, sardines, any kind of wild caught fish and seafood, amazing. Definitely top of the list for me.
What about dairy? What are your thoughts on dairy?
So dairy's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Dairy, humans, we use technology to feed ourselves, and we invented agriculture as a way to grow plants and get way more carbohydrates and increase energy in our diet. And we domesticated animals, and we've figured out, hey, if you feed an animal really well and keep it sheltered its whole life, it's a lot fatter and you can add a lot more energy to your diet just instantly. It's an instant win. And then when we invented the dairy agriculture, it's like, oh, hey, you've got this animal that the very highest energy density part of the animal is the milk it produces. It's very high in lactose or milk sugar and milk fat because it's trying to concentrate energy and pass it on to its offspring to turn a baby cow into a giant cow as fast as possible. So milk is actually an extremely high energy food. And it's actually very low in protein to energy ratio. The protein percentage of milk is fairly low. It has good protein in it, but what it really has is a lot of good carbs and fats, milk, sugar, and milk fat. So this is
I'm sorry, like whole milk, you would say, right? Or raw
right,
milk.
right.
What about raw milk, if you could get that?
Raw milk. I'm talking about raw milk, whole
Yeah.
milk, milk. It's basically just one of the highest energy density foods you can get. It's one of the few foods in nature that have carbs and fats in it together, which we know drives overeating in most omnivore mammals. And so you're just going to eat the hell out of it, and it's going to fatten you up really rapidly. And so this is a food that's very high quality nutrition, right? The carbs and the fats and the protein are designed for mammals. So we know it's the one food on earth that we know is actually designed for mammals to eat, but it's also designed for mammals to overeat and gain mass really rapidly on. So my thoughts on dairy are, what if we could take the good parts of dairy, but leave behind some of the energy because everybody's already energy toxic, right? Which is why I like any dairy that's lower in carbs or lower in fat, or ideally lower in both. So fermented dairy is awesome because all the lactose is gone. Bacteria have consumed it all and left behind lactic acid or something like that. I also like ultra filtered dairy, something that's lower in fat, lower in carbs, lower in lactose, which a lot of people don't tolerate. So any kind of low carb and low fat dairy, I like. I like whey powder. I like a Fairlife milk. I like cottage cheese. I like Greek yogurt. It's awesome. And if you're already too fat, you literally want a low fat version of these. If you're trying to lose fat, you want a low fat cottage cheese or low fat plain Greek yogurt or some sort of fermented dairy that's going to be low carb and low fat, a lot lower energy. What are you left with? All the protein and the minerals and the nutrients. It's phenomenal. So I'm a big fan of dairy. And I also think this is another example of where processed foods, the whole concept of a food being processed, making it bad, I think is really not accurate because Humans, we basically evolved to eat processed and cooked foods. Humans are cuisinivores, which means we process and cook all our food to extract maximum nutrient density out of it. We've been doing that for millennia. We butcher an animal and then cook the meat, and we get a much higher nutrient yield and nutrient density. And we take plant foods and we'll ferment them, we'll soak them, we'll sprout them, we'll crush them, we'll grind them. We're doing all this processing to maximize nutrient density and nutrient absorption and nutrient yield. And so cooking and processing is essential to what made us human. That's where we traded off these giant brains and these fairly small GI tracts. And you have to do that to have optimum success as a Homo sapien. So I actually like things like processed dairy, because I think this is where one place where technology and food processing has increased nutrient density versus some other areas where food processing has decreased nutrient density. That's where we just suck all the carbs and fats out of a food and just add empty calorie energy. That's your sugar, your flour, and your oil. We
Right.
took a food, we stripped out all the hydrocarbons and carbohydrates, basically just the pure chains of carbon, high energy bonds. And now you've got like cookies and shortbread and cakes and stuff. It's just basically sugar, flour, oil, pure energy with none of the satiety.
Right. Actually, that led right into my next question, because we're talking about things to eat and then things to not eat. What would you say would be the biggest things? Obviously, you just sort of said them, but to avoid, because sometimes that's easier for people. If you just eliminate the things that you don't want to eat, it can sort of, it could be a big list, but it can help sort of simplify things as far as diet is concerned.
Right. So in this whole PE diet concept, what we're really down on is refined carbs and refined fats.
Okay.
So, a lot of people are afraid of carbs, and so they'll say, well, I'm not going to eat an apple because that's carbs, and I'm not going to eat fruit because that's carbs, and I'm not going to eat certain, like potato because that's carbs. I think that's a wrong approach, because those are actually low carb carbs. All of those carbs, your fruit and your apples and your potatoes, they have so much fiber and water, and the energy density is so low. The amount of actual carb you get is so low that it's not that big a deal. What you really want to be afraid of is your high carb carbs. That's your refined carbs. That's your sugar and your flour. The amount of actual carbohydrate you're getting per unit of food, weight or volume or however you want to measure it, is off the charts with these refined ones. So the carbs you want to be afraid of are refined carbs. You want to be afraid of your high carb carbs, not your low carb carbs, which is
Like,
your fruit and your tubers. Same thing with fat. Like everyone's like, oh, I'm not going to eat an egg or an avocado or a piece of meat because that's way too much fat. Well, these foods have so much protein and minerals and water and other stuff in them that they're actually low fat fats. The fats you need to be afraid of are the refined fats, like your butter and your heavy cream and your oil. And if you actually look at how many grams you're getting for the unit of food, it's just ridiculously high. So carbs and fats, you have to look at the energy density and how refined it is. And you have to stay away from the high fat fats, which are the refined concentrated fats that are low in protein and water and mineral. And that's all your refined stuff, your oil, your butter, your heavy cream.
what do you like
And
to
then
cook with then? I'm sorry to interrupt, but what do you like to cook with then?
I like to cook with avocado oil. I do
Okay.
actually cook with some sort of butter or oil. I just try to keep the quantities low. If
Hmm.
you're really, really getting aggressive with shaving down fat grams, I like an avocado oil spray or something like that. A nonstick pan and avocado oil spray. You don't have to cook with a ton of fat. I do recommend, cooking a lot of foods with some fat. And you never want to go to zero on any of these macros, but
Right.
you definitely don't have to deep fry everything in soybean oil and, just try to eat a whole ton of fat. Yeah, I do think that, all of this is again on a U-shaped curve where you don't want to shave your fat to zero for sure, but you want to be mindful of these high fat fats like your refined fats.
Right. Which seems to be flooding the market, like adding fats to everything. And I think you got to sort of find that balance. And what about like insulin spikes, glucose spikes. I just wore a CGM for a couple of weeks just to see how foods impacted my blood sugar. And so you talk about carbs and things like potatoes and things like that. Is that something that you look into with your clients or for yourself?
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's a really bad trend I see out there right now. So everyone's got a CGM, right? I'm wearing a CGM, you're wearing a CGM, all my patients have CGMs,
Hmm.
and we're all just fetishizing the perfectly flat CGM, right? It's like, oh wow, look, I ate an apple and I got a big spike, and that's why I'm never going to eat an apple again. Instead, I'm just going to eat 3 pounds of macadamia nuts, and you get this perfectly flat thing. But what you don't see is the next day, the baseline just went up a little bit. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
24 hours a day, your blood sugar's 2 points higher than it was because of all the fat that you ate. And what people don't get is that the fatter you are, the higher your baseline sugar is all the time. You know what I
Right.
mean? So if I just eat nothing but butter, I will never get a spike on my CGM. But I will be hungry. I will eat more calories. I will basically end up being fatter. The protein energy ratio in my body is going to go down. And then my baseline, my basal insulin, my basal glucose, my A1C, everything's going to creep up a little bit. I'll have slightly higher triglycerides, blood sugar, insulin, glucose, A1C, anything you can measure. I'll never see a spike. I'll have the flattest CGM curve you've ever seen. I'll be posting it on Instagram. I'll be like, look at that.
Right.
Look at all these morons eating an apple because they got this spike. And then the reality is these spikes don't really matter, right? When I do high intensity exercise, I can get a huge spike in glucose, a diabetic spike. Does that mean that I should never exercise? Hell no. I mean, like, exercise does all this bad stuff to you. It's very inflammatory. It tears your muscles, raises inflammation, spikes your blood sugar, dumps all this glycogen from your liver. It does all this stuff that could be thought of as bad, you know, and in the end, you're actually way better off. It makes you way, way better. And so I don't want anyone to eat to their glucometer and to be just terrified of these spikes. It's different if you're a type 1 diabetic. Now, if you're a type 1 diabetic, because we don't have an artificial pancreas yet that dumps insulin out right next to your liver where it's supposed to, and instead you're having to inject insulin way out in the periphery under your skin, there's no good way to deal with carbs. So your type 1 diabetics, yes, should be on the lowest carb diet they can stand. But for anybody with a functioning pancreas, you really shouldn't be afraid of these spikes. You shouldn't be completely terrified of them. I almost cringe when people slap a CGM on
Hmm.
because it's going to drive them to
Crazy.
make it's going to drive them crazy,
Yeah.
and they're going to make dietary choices that do not necessarily give them the highest satiety per calorie.
The interesting thing I learned, I had it on for 2 weeks, and um, it was I liked it. I think that it could drive you a little bit crazy. I did notice that I was more aware of like inputting the foods that I had and how that affected me. But um, like you said, it's more about sort of that average of what your insulin is throughout the day, because if you get spikes, that's fine as long as it comes back to the norm, right?
Right? I'm more worried about people's basal than their spikes, to be
Yeah,
honest. I really
yeah.
am.
Is there anything else any other markers that you look at for individuals other than perhaps, obviously fasting insulin? Anything else?
I mean, my favorite thing out there is waist circumference. Like, this is just a amazing measurement. I mean, it tracks almost perfectly linearly with fasting insulin and overall insulin sensitivity. And waist circumference, or even better yet, a waist to height ratio,
Mm.
is just a phenomenal marker of how healthy you are metabolically. And to me, it's so much more
Simple.
important than weight. Yeah, it's very simple. It's
Simple,
free.
right? So is that because of the visceral fat? And just,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, the more visceral fat you're gonna have, the bigger your waist circumference right at the belly button is going to be, and that's why it remains a pretty good metric even in people who are visibly fairly lean and quote unquote skinny fat. So
Hmm.
love waist circumference. I could probably replace half the labs I ever do with just a simple
Hmm.
waist circumference. I mean, these things are really, I mean, just basically how you look in the mirror, your waist circumference. I think it's more important than weight by a mile.
I agree. I mean, how you feel. It's like the whole BMI thing is just junk. I mean,
BMI is it's helpful on a population level, and on
yeah,
an individual level, it's just trash. It's total trash.
yeah. Yeah, how you feel, how you look. I mean, I weigh 170, but like you wouldn't, you might guess that, oh, you weigh 150, but why weigh 170? Because a lot of it's muscle, and like, you just can't
Hmm.
tell. I think that's that's obviously a good thing, just to how you look, how you feel, and waist circumference is a big deal. Um, I wanted to ask you a few more questions. We've hit on a lot of good stuff. Who's your biggest influence in your life, and how did they sort of influence you to get you into where you're at?
Oh wow. Well, yeah, okay. In this whole like diet and exercise nutrition realm,
Yeah.
big influences. Mark Sisson. I love his approach. Looking at everything through an ancestral lens makes a lot of sense to me.
Hmm.
When it comes to exercise, Dr. Doug McGuff, super awesome guy. Really, just Body by Science, amazing book. Really an eye opener for me. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, those are probably some of my bigger diet and exercise influences right there.
Yeah, I've heard so many great things about Mark Sisson. You're not the first person to say that they helped influence their trajectory in health. Um, and then a question that I ask all my guests is, what would be, and it's a bit of a loaded question, but one tip for individuals to help get their body back to what it once was? Because I just find this, it's a common theme. You get into your even 30s or 40s or 50s and 60s, and you're like, God, 10 years go by. What the heck happened? What would be, one tip you'd give to that individual to help get their body back to what it once was?
Oh wow. Just if you could only do one thing
Mhm.
to maximally improve your body composition, it would be replace all your carbs with protein.
I
Yeah.
like
If I
that.
if
Yeah.
I could only give everybody one thing to do, it's replace your carbs with protein, then and you're done. That's basically just hitting the win button. That's the finish line right there in one step, pretty much.
And I like that because I'm all about keeping things simple. And, we got the new year coming up. So that would be a great thing, just to go into the new year and just replace all your carbs with a high quality protein, right?
Right.
Awesome. Well, where would be a great place for people to find you? I know you obviously with your book, The PE Diet. Um, what's your website?
Oh, well, I have a website, burnfatnotsugar.com.
Okay.
Uh, but probably my best source of information is the book, The PE Diet, and you can buy it at thepediet.com, or it's pretty much in most, it's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all these bookstores. But yeah, thepediet.com is a good place to pick up the book. That's probably my best work so far.
Yeah.
And personally, I'm on Twitter at Ted Naiman, and I'm on all the socials with that handle.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. This was a lot of knowledge packed in. So I appreciate you coming on, Dr. Ted.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, have a great day. Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangrin.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again, and have a great day.